The cinematic philosopher Ferris Bueller once said that life moves pretty fast, and if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you might miss it. The ever-growing collection of writings on this page are from my life. Moments spread out over a quarter of a century when I've stopped and looked around once in a while and wrote it down. Not years later and filtered through rose or gray-colored glasses. It's what I saw in that moment. It's what I didn't miss. When my late mother shared devotions with my youngest brother and I, she'd pull an old chair between our two beds in our old country house in North Dakota, and she'd sit down for the first time all day and pull out an old Bible storybook. And now it sits on a shelf in my basement, surrounded by books from my own children's youth. Often she'd talk about listening for God's gentle whisper in our lives. It came from two Old Testament stories, one with a young boy named Samuel, the other with a rugged prophet named Elijah. In Elijah's story, there was a lot going on, but he needed to hear God's voice. From 1 Kings 19. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And it was at this point where my mother would pause and look first at my brother and then at me and then say in a quiet, dramatic voice that God was in that gentle whisper. And then she'd tell a story to make that real for us. She's not here to tell the story, so instead I'm going to read a little story that I wrote 12 years or so ago for our monthly church newsletter after many of you visited us in Chicago for the first time. It's titled, How It Happened. How it happened. On a cold winter's night back in 2004, 9 little girls sat in a sparsely furnished room in a civil affairs building in a huge city in China, staring out as a crowd of funny-looking Westerners filed in, holding cameras, Kleenexes, and really big folders of paper. It was the first trip of any kind for the 11-month-olds who had each spent the past 10.5 months in the same little orphanage in a rural town 2 hours to the north. Since their birthdays were all within 2 weeks of each other, they had likely spent most of that time sharing the same room, the same meals, even the same cribs. The nannies and government workers and agency guides in the civil affairs building had seen it all before and knew that these little girls not only would be leaving the only home they'd ever known, they'd be leaving each other as well. The 9 families on the other side of the room would soon scatter across their home country, and while the little girls would soon be the loving focus of their new families, their memories of each other would fade away with time. Over Labor Day weekend 2007, a group of these little girls sat together on Hope Church's stage with the children at worship regulars, staring out again at a crowd of funny-looking Westerners, this time holding psalters and Bibles and really big bulletins. In what would surely come as a surprise to those nannies and government workers and guides, it was their 8th reunion in 28 months, with no end in sight. Another reunion is set for 6 of the families in November, another in January, and then an all-family get-together in June of next year. When the director for our adoption agency saw our first group photo, taken 18 months after our China flights had each touched down stateside, he was stunned. He said he'd never seen a group stay together in this way. Most groups stay connected only superficially, if at all, he explained, like classmates who get together every few years to retell remembered rites of passage. How did this happen, he wanted to know. Numerous people at Hope asked the same question over Labor Day. Well, first of all, it wasn't planned. In fact, for many of the months and years leading up to our trip to China, Nadia and I were going to use a well-known East Coast agency that touted its expertise in China adoptions while admitting that they were more paper pushers than relationship builders. That was okay with us at the time. We had enough friends, and we simply needed help being united with our daughter. That changed one Sunday, however, when an older couple at Hope Church pushed a videotape into our hands in the foyer after church. We knew them casually, familiar faces from the other side of the church sanctuary, but hardly enough to call them friends. It was a random adoption videotape that they'd run into at a conference, but they'd thought of us in our journey, and Nadia and I smiled and nodded and shrugged our shoulders at each other and stuck it in the VCR that evening, just as an afterthought, just being polite. As the video ended, however, we realized that its vision of adoption and faith meshed completely with our own. I looked over at Nadia and I said simply, "I guess we just changed agencies." So, that little act in the Hope Church foyer led us to be grouped together with people of similar faiths and passions who have become extended family to us. But what has happened is more than the agency and more than a common faith, since two of our families had traveled with the same agencies a few years before, and those travel groups had faded in significance, like most others. So the question remains, how did it happen? Well, it didn't happen on the flight to China, even though many of us met on that flight and passed the 14 hours by walking through the aisles of the giant 777, looking for hints of the purple and gold ribbons that our group had agreed to attach to our luggage and carry-ons, as a signal that the April Fireflies, the month our dossiers had been finally completed, were on board. It didn't happen in Beijing, even though we shared a day there like no other. It didn't happen in the girls' home village, though the seeds were planted on an unscheduled but hard-fought-for and ultimately unforgettable visit to the girls' hometown and orphanage gates. It didn't happen in the giant metropolis with the Civil Affairs building, though the seeds began to germinate on a smoggy Sunday as we met informally in a 35th floor playroom to sing praise songs and share verses and prayers while dark-haired little girls played with toys at our feet. It didn't happen in Guangzhou, home of the American Embassy, where we would finalize our adoptions. In fact, in the tourist-trod landscape of this southern town, seeds like these often become neglected and fade away quickly. No, in fact, it didn't happen in China at all. It happened in Lexington, Kentucky, at a picnic hosted by our adoption agency 6 months after our return. We were happy to see each other, but there had been no plans for further get-togethers. That is, until Elizabeth, who at the time showed little or no affection for anyone, stood next to one of her Hunan sisters, Grace Ann, and began to gently rub her back, without thinking, a reflex almost. And E.B. and Grace Ann weren't the only ones, just the first that were noticed. There were similar reconnections occurring between the other girls as well. Like many of life's great moments, this was first noticed and understood by the women in the group. Us men were likely off telling stories or roughhousing with the older kids. The mamas, as we called them in our group, were watching the girls and observing. Watching Elizabeth, who would scream if anyone tried to hold her, who a few weeks earlier at Hope Church had refused to let Pastor Roger hold her during her baptism, settling only for her daddy for the hair wedding and for her mama for the trek around the sanctuary. And now Nadia watched as her normally frenetic little girl calmly allowed Grace Ann's mama to pick her up, hold her, and talk to her gently in her southern drawl. The mamas all noticed. There was something there, something in the way that the girls looked at each other, trusted each other. These girls, who had needed to be strong and tough and detached to survive, were relaxed around each other. Their memories of each other had not faded, and the peace they felt around each other was unmistakable and remarkable, even to their daddies, who had to be pulled in and prodded before they too saw the unfamiliar calm in their daughter's normally stormy wake. On that day, we began to talk, not just as a group of people who had shared a grand adventure and who would always have a special bond, but as an extended family who realized that we could give our girls a gift that we hadn't thought possible, a gift of continued relationship with the only people they'd know in their entire lives, a gift that would cost us no more than time and travel and effort. It is a gift that has led us to repeated reunions in Lexington, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Chicago, with more hometowns to visit in Tennessee, Texas, and Colorado, and perhaps with a hoped-for major reunion in China when these girls are older. It is a gift that didn't start with a grand gesture in an exotic locale, but with a simple, affectionate touch between two little girls who, in lives already shaped by too many ships passing in the night, had reached for a familiar fellowship mate, all in sight of their watchful, weary, and suddenly teary mamas. And that's how it happened. So now to tie this to today, to this Sweet 16 gathering, to this little church service, and to my mother's reading from 1 Kings. My mother would say that it's true, that God's presence most often comes in a whisper. And I won't disagree with my mom. I believe that the old couple in the Hope Church foyer heard a gentle whisper and listened, leading Nadia and I to a very specific adoption agency. I believe that each of the parents here today heard the gentle whisper that led us each to our daughters. And I believe that each of the mamas on that day in Lexington heard a gentle whisper as well that led to our daughters being part of this extended family, our China family. So thanks be to God for his gentle whispers and for loved ones in our lives who share whispers with us and poke us in the side and tell us to listen already. My prayer for our daughters and our sons too is that your lives will be marked by other times when you'll hear and listen to God's gentle whispers in your life. Amen.